Welcome to CHD 122. This lecture will cover Chapter 1 of your textbook, which is called Beginning Essentials in Early Childhood Education by Ann Miles Gordon and Catherine Williams Brown. What we'll talk about here is, like I said, the history of early childhood education, which has not been a class that people have studied in college for a really long time. It really started as a discipline within higher ed in the late 70s, early 80s. So before that, they didn't really, education folks didn't really consider early childhood education all that different from education. And we'll talk about why it really is a different animal altogether. So, here are some things that you should think about as you go through this whole course. What's your personal early childhood experience? So, did you go to preschool or daycare? Did you go half day kindergarten or all day kindergarten? And do you have children? Are there children in your life somehow? Um, my experience is I stayed home with my mom, did not go to preschool or daycare because that was not a thing that people really did back then. Half day kindergarten, and my kids started going to preschool or childcare when they were. My oldest is 18 months. My youngest was probably 6 weeks. Um, I think it's important for kids to have opportunities outside their homes to learn to socialize with other children, to learn how to interact with other adults. So I think it's really important. So, if you currently work in early childhood, we're going to learn about the philosophies and theories that underlie what we do. And we'll want to think about what are the philosophies or theories that you use in your program. And what is the effect of your cultural background on the early childhood experience or the way you view early childhood today? So, obviously, you think it's important because you signed up for this class, right? But some cultures don't think that kids should leave, um, mom's care until 5 or even older. So, we'll talk about that. What is early childhood? Well, early childhood is infancy through age 8. Generally, in education um, standards, we talk about early childhood as pre-K through third grade. So, and early childhood education is a group setting. So it's not just one kid at home, it's having a child be in a setting where they are with other children. Early childhood programs are anything for infants through grade 3. So, early childhood programs refers to public school, um, preschool or pre-kindergarten. It refers to the infant room in a child care center. It refers to second graders. Those are early childhood programs as well. And early childhood educators are professionals who build bridges between a child's two worlds, school and home. And that is, there are two really important things there. One, professionals. Early childhood educators are professionals. We're not just babysitters, we're not just daycare workers. We are early childhood professionals, and our job is to help children navigate between home and school. So we're basically setting them up for life, but also specifically for making the transition from being at home all the time with mom and dad or family, and then going to school where you're going to spend a lot of time. Who influenced early childhood education? Well, there are four basic groups that kind of influence the way we think about early childhood education. Doctors, people who looked at the way children grow and learn, educators, teachers, obviously, and psychologists who looked at how children develop. Um, and then also philosophers and clergy, pastors, people who deal with children and families. So, the four basic themes are social reform, it includes childcare and education reform, childhood the realization that children are not little adults, that there are specific things that happen in childhood that don't happen in other areas of your life. And we need to be wary of things like abuse and neglect, and that family and community bear a very important impact on childhood. Um, the transmission of values. So, what in today's culture beyond the family influences the values children develop? So, that's the media, violence, diversity, what's happening out in the world. How do those things help children's values develop or not? And then aspects of professionalism. So we are going to talk about how teachers are teachers, engaging in DAP, which is developmentally appropriate practice, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about, ethical teaching, advocacy. We need, as early childhood uh, professionals, to be advocates for our field. This is a really interesting thing. When you look at a lot of careers or fields out there in the world, there are a lot of people advocating for them. For instance, unions advocate for the people who are working in their union, auto workers or domestic workers have unions. We don't have that in early childhood. And so there aren't really a lot of people who are specifically advocating on behalf of early childhood educators. NAEYC, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, does advocacy work, and it's important. What happens a lot of times is people don't see early childhood education as a profession, and therefore the voices of the people in the profession aren't heard. In addition to that, most of the people working in early childhood education are people who are moms who have their own kids, who have lives outside early childhood education. And so it's hard to harness their energy to focus to advocate for the field when they've got 150 other things going on. These are some of the early influencers of early childhood education. Mostly right here, we have a monk, uh, an educator, and a couple of philosophers. These are people who back in the 15th through the 18th century were thinking about children specifically, which was new for the time. Luther over there on the left was a lawyer and a monk, and his influence is that he thought all children should be able to read and be educated. His thinking was that they should all be able to read so they could read the Bible, but it expanded beyond that as well. If you could read the Bible, you could read about the news that was happening in your community. So it was important to be able to read. Comenius was a Czechoslovakian educator, and he wrote the first picture book for children, which is on page 5 of your text. So it was, 1592 or so before anybody thought, "Oh, hey, maybe kids would like to look at books." Whoa, crazy. And then we have Locke and Rousseau. We're both thinking about how children fit in the world, philosophers, um, and how we can educate them. So Locke believed that children are a blank slate and they come into the world with no ideas or thoughts or anything, abilities, and that the environment is how they learn what's going on around them. And he believed in a sensory approach to learning, which we'll talk a lot about. Rousseau believed that children are naturally good. They learn bad things by seeing them in their environment, and that education should be for learning, not just working. So, not just training someone to do a job, but actually teaching them to think so that they can learn. Then we go a little bit later and we have Pestalozzi, Froebel, Steiner, and then probably the first name that you've heard, Montessori, and then the Macmillan sisters. So these were all people who were thinking about the way children learn, which was not something that had been spent a lot of time on before that. Okay. Pestalozzi was interested in thinking about the whole curriculum and teaching children in groups. Froebel was super interested in play and developed a whole set of toys that are very specific and have very specific purposes that are all about building and architecture. He was an early influencer of Maria Montessori, who we'll get to. And then Rudolf Steiner was the founder of the Waldorf School. He believed in very specific developmental phases. And the Waldorf School is a very interesting way of working with children, which we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about different types of programs. Maria Montessori, you may have heard of Montessori schools. They're still very popular in the United States and abroad. She was the first female doctor in Italy, and she started a full day center for ages 2 to 5. And really, what she was doing was training her 2 to 5-year-old children to be good workers. They were originally, the children that she worked with were orphans, and so she was training them to be servants in well-to-do people's homes. So if you think about Montessori, one of the things that is an important part in a Montessori classroom is cleaning and washing dishes and that kind of stuff. So that's where that comes from. Um, she really focused on independence, discipline, and practical skills, and we'll learn a bit about that a little bit more. The Macmillan sisters in London in the early 1900s had an open air nursery, and if you Google it, you can find pictures of it. They were very concerned about children whose parents were both working, and these children were basically just hanging out on the streets. In London at that time, there were factories where moms and dads would go to work, and so the kids would just be doing whatever they did all day. And the Macmillan sisters opened a nursery where the kids could come and sleep and have baths and get fresh air. And it was the first nursery school. So in America, once the colonists settled here in America, they learned for religious purposes, reading the Bible, similar to what we heard about Luther back there. They were taught at home, or there were small schools for boys only, and girls learned not so much educational things as practical things, how to run a home. Before the Civil War, there was little education for Black children, but Black families and Black communities did put together Sabbath schools. So these were schools that met on Sundays and they had religious training, but they included reading training in there because um, teaching slaves to read was against the law. So they would make it part of their religious training. And they also had midnight schools. So it was, at nighttime after everyone was asleep, they would do their learning. And then after the Civil War, schools and colleges were established by and for Blacks and former slaves. And we've been working on integration ever since, right? John Dewey is a very important voice in education in the United States of America. And he founded the progressive movement of education. And his thinking was that children are valuable and childhood is important, and that the best way that people learn is through experience. So the traditional rule of education was school was to transmit information and skills to the new generation. Teachers communicated that, enforced rules, and taught as a finished product. So that was you're going to school, the teacher's in charge, you're going to learn this. When you've learned that, we're done. His idea about education was that you needed to express yourself, you needed to learn through experience, so doing things, and it needed to be meaningful to you. So, all education comes from experience, but not all experiences are educational. Experiences should promote their interest in learning and influence later experiences. So, the more positive experiences you have, the better off you will be at learning later on. So educators, teachers need to understand how children learn, and they need to know how to use physical and social ways to build these experiences, right? So when we talk about and we talk about this a lot in early childhood education, play as a form of learning. What we're really talking about is experiences, that children should be immersed in experiences, not sitting at a desk just doing worksheets. Okay, so following Dewey's ideas, you had a lot of ladies come forward. And as I've taught this class before, it's been interesting to me. Um, my students have said, well, back 3 slides ago, it's all men talking about young children. And now in the world, it's really early childhood education is a very woman centered field. Well, because back here, women didn't have time to think about these things. And if, Rousseau or Locke had asked a woman, right, about how do you raise children, they probably would have told them what they needed to know, but that wasn't the way it worked. So, Patty Smith Hill was a worked with Dewey. She trained with Froebel, and she founded the National Association of Education for Young Children, and she wrote Happy Birthday. Crazy. Lucy Sprague Mitchell was another teacher who saw schools as community centers. And her whole idea was that you bring the children together and you use them for research. So, observation and analysis of the children in an early childhood classroom is how you learn, right? So, the Bank Street College of Education is a working preschool program with teachers who are there learning how to be teachers. It's what we call a lab school. And we kind of use the Parkland Child Development Center a little bit like that. There's also on the campus of the U of I, a school where children go to school so that teachers can study how they learn. And that was a Lucy Sprague Mitchell idea. And one of her students was Margaret Weiss Brown, who wrote Goodnight Moon. Abigail Elliott worked with the Macmillan sisters back at their open air nursery in London, and she brought that idea to school to the United States, and she was a social worker. So, starting in the 1920s and 30s, upper middle class families decided that their children needed a place to go, and they started developing nursery schools. But it didn't serve poor families. Poor families couldn't pay for it. It didn't fit into their worldview. And so it was a child centered approach, active learning, and social cooperation. Child centered approach, meaning the child is figuring out what they're interested in and gets to kind of center and move forward with various activities. Active learning, not just sitting still, moving around, touching things, and then social cooperation. In any early childhood venue, social cooperation, social emotional development is huge because that's when those years, that infant through age 8, is when you really develop your social emotional skills. The first kindergarten was Froebel's in Germany in 1837, and then it started in the United States in 1873. In the 1970s, it started to shift to a more academic focus. I was in kindergarten in 1975, and my kindergarten was what preschool is now, right? My daughter started kindergarten in 2008, and her kindergarten was basically what I did in first grade. So we've, moved those academic focus down, and we keep doing that. And I don't think that's a great idea. And we'll talk about why. In the 1990s, we started talking about developmentally appropriate practice. And right now, we're sort of in a standards and teacher directed instruction phase. We need to get out of that. We need to be more interested in providing for children the way they actually learn. Childcare. Mothers started joining the workforce like universally during World War II because we ran out of men here in the United States to do the jobs. So mothers had been working all along, but it became a much larger trend in World War II times in the 40s, 50s. So Kaiser Shipbuilding in California was the first company to provide company-based childcare, and it was institutionalized. So in the 40s and 50s, we started seeing childcare centers become a thing, and it, expanding exponentially in the 70s and 80s. And in 1965, Head Start started, and Head Start is a federal program run by local regional planning commissions, part of the county, um, but federally mandated following federal rules. And Head Start was a program that was begun so that children who came from backgrounds of poverty could have the advantages that they needed to start school when they started kindergarten at a level place with children from higher income homes. So they provide educational, social, medical, dental, nutritional, and mental health services to low income preschoolers and their families. So parental involvement is a really important part of Head Start. I will post some videos about Head Start so you know a little bit more about it, and we'll talk about it a little bit more as we go along. So, what are we talking about? We're talking about medicine, education, psychology, and brain research really are the influences of how we think about early childhood education. There are a lot of people who come out of medicine, like Maria Montessori, like Sigmund Freud, who are interested in how children develop. And then we have the education people, like Dewey, um, who put their 2 cents in. And then we have psychologists, and we'll talk a lot about psychologists and their developmental learning theories, like Skinner and Vygotsky. We'll talk about that. And then neuroscience, actually looking at the science of the brain and how it all works together. So, what are the issues that we um, need to confront in early childhood education today? It's huge. It's so huge. And we are understanding more and more, especially right now, about why early childhood education is so important. Um, we know that high quality early childhood education leads to less incarceration. It leads to more graduation from high school. It leads to higher wages later in life. Quality childcare, quality early childhood education makes an amazingly lasting impact on a child's life. What happens to them from 0 to 8 really controls the rest of their lives from a physical, mental, social standpoint. So it's so important. Um, we know that all of the things that happen to them in childhood influence the rest of their lives. I just said that, but I can't say it enough. And then what we need to do is think about how are the things that we're doing in our classrooms that we're exposing children to, how do they impact those children's values and behavior? And we need to be professionals and we need to be viewed as professionals. Teaching preschool is not babysitting. Teaching preschool is teaching children how they need to behave, what the expectations are for them in their lives. This is really, really important work and it doesn't get enough credit. Hopefully, in the future, we'll see more credit and we'll see more emphasis on this. But for now, we just need to remember how important it is and go forward doing the best that we can. Okay, that's it for chapter 1.